Sometimes mercy costs everything, and sometimes it changes a whole town. In the frozen heart of a Rocky Mountain blizzard, a drifting cowboy and his stubborn donkey stumbled upon a woman left to die in the snow, cast out by her own people, accused of witchcraft for knowing old healing ways. What Elias Cole did next would strip him of warmth and shelter, but it would also put him face to face with the very townspeople who tried to murder the woman he saved. When death came calling for their children the next morning, those same people had nowhere else to turn. Would the woman they condemned to freeze show them the same mercy they denied her? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind had teeth that morning, the kind that bit through wool and leather like they were nothing but paper. Elias Cole felt it the moment he stepped out of his bedroll, his breath forming clouds in the pre-dawn darkness. He was a man in his mid-50s, though the mountains had a way of adding years to a face, deep lines around his eyes, weathered skin the color of old saddle leather, and a beard more salt than pepper these days. His hands, though, those were still steady. A lifetime of hard work and harder choices had given him that much. He moved with the quiet efficiency of someone who'd spent most of his life alone. The camp was simple, a small fire pit, his bedroll under a canvas tarp stretched between two pines, and his wagon nearby with its patched cover tied down tight. Buster, his grey donkey, stood hobbled a few yards away, ears twitching as he watched Elias stir the embers back to life. "Morning, old friend," Elias said, his voice rough from sleep and disuse. Talking to a donkey might seem strange to some folks, but when you spent most of your days without human company, you learned to appreciate any conversation you could get. "Looks like we picked a fine time to cross these mountains." Buster snorted, a sound Elias had learned to interpret over their 15 years together. This particular snort meant the donkey agreed that the weather looked bad, but what were they going to do about it? They'd been in worse spots before, and they had. Elias remembered the flash flood in New Mexico, the mountain lion in Colorado, the time they'd gotten turned around in a dust storm so thick you couldn't see your own feet. Each time, they'd looked out for each other. That was the thing about Buster. He wasn't just transportation or a beast of burden. He was partner, friend, and sometimes the only reason Elias kept moving forward instead of lying down in some lonely canyon and letting the world take him. Elias pulled on his coat, thick sheepskin lined with wool, and ran his hand along his belt as he buckled it. The buckle was old cavalry issue, crossed sabers in tarnished silver that he kept meaning to polish, but never quite got around to. He'd earned it 20-some years ago, back when he wore a uniform and followed orders and believed the world made a certain kind of sense. The buckle was about all he had left from those days, besides the discipline and the scars. He'd been a good soldier, a cavalry scout specifically, which meant he rode ahead of the main column looking for water, danger, the best route through country that wanted to kill you. He learned to read land the way some men read books, to notice the small things that meant the difference between living and dying. A certain type of grass meant water nearby. Birds circling in a particular pattern meant carrion, which might mean hostile Indians or bandits, or just nature taking its course. The way shadows fell across a ridge could hide an ambush or reveal a game trail. Those skills had kept him alive long after he'd hung up the uniform, but they hadn't been enough to save what mattered most. Elias shook off the memory before it could take hold. Some things you learned to live with by not thinking about them too hard. He'd lost his wife Margaret and their 2 daughters to cholera back in '73 when he was stationed at Fort Bowie. One day he'd had a family, a future, a reason to settle down once his enlistment was up. 3 weeks later, he had 3 graves and a hole in his chest that never quite healed. That was when he started drifting. He'd tried to stay in one place a few times over the years, took work as a ranch hand here, a wagon guard there, even tried his hand at prospecting for a while. But towns had a way of feeling too crowded, too full of other people's lives and futures, and all the things he'd lost. So he kept moving, kept to the high country and the lonely trails, kept company with Buster and the wind. The sky was the color of old pewter, heavy with the promise of snow. Elias studied it with the practiced eye of someone who'd learned to read weather the way a banker reads ledgers. The clouds were moving fast from the northwest, low and dense, and the temperature had dropped 10 degrees since sunset. The wind carried that particular smell, sharp, clean, electric, that meant serious snow was coming. "We've got maybe 6-8 hours before it hits hard," he told Buster, who was now munching on some dried grass Elias had scattered for him. "Question is, do we push through and try to get over the pass, or do we hunker down and wait it out?" The pass was still a good 15 miles ahead, maybe more. The trail would climb another 2,000 feet before it crested, then drop down into the valley where the settlement of Hope's End sat. Elias had been planning to bypass Hope's End entirely. He had no business there, and towns generally had no business with him, but the weather might force his hand. He'd heard about Hope's End from a trader a few weeks back. Small settlement, maybe 50 families, tucked into a valley on the western slope of the Rockies. Founded 6 or 7 years ago by folks looking to make a fresh start, though in Elias's experience, the farther you ran from your problems, the more likely they were to follow you. The trader had mentioned they were friendly enough to travelers, at least those who didn't stay too long or ask too many questions. Elias loaded up the wagon with practiced efficiency. His supplies were simple but well chosen. Flour, coffee, salt pork, beans, a few cans of peaches he'd been saving for a special occasion that never seemed to come. He had his bedroll, his rifle, his revolver, a Navy Colt that had seen better days but still shot straight when he needed it to. And he had the buffalo robes, 3 of them, thick and warm and heavy. Those robes had been a gift from a Crow chief, whose son Elias had pulled from a river during his cavalry days. The chief had said they were to keep him warm in his old age. Elias hadn't felt old then. He did now. The landscape around him was the kind of beautiful that could kill you if you weren't careful. Pines climbed the slopes in dark ranks, their branches already weighted with old snow. Above them, aspens stood bare and white like bone against the grey sky. The mountains themselves rose up in jagged peaks, still snow-capped even though it was only late October. This high up, winter came early and stayed late, and if you got caught unprepared, well, the mountains didn't care about your plans. Elias hitched Buster to the wagon and swung up onto the seat. The donkey leaned into the harness without being asked, his breath steaming in the cold air. They'd done this dance so many times that words weren't necessary. Elias had the reins, but Buster had his own ideas about pace and direction, and over the years they'd learned to negotiate. The trail wound upward through the pines, narrow and rocky in places, smoothed by countless hooves and wheels in others. Elias kept his eyes moving, watching for loose stones or hidden ice, for deadfall across the path or signs of recent animal activity. A bear getting ready for hibernation could be mean and unpredictable. A mountain cat protecting a kill wouldn't hesitate to attack if it felt threatened. But mostly, he watched the sky. The clouds were building faster than he'd expected, piling up against the peaks like they were being pushed by some giant hand. The wind was picking up too, gusting now instead of just blowing steady. It rattled through the pines with a sound like rushing water, and every so often a harder gust would hit the wagon broadside, making it sway on its wheels. "Should have started yesterday," Elias muttered. But yesterday the sky had been clear, and he'd thought he had time. That was the thing about mountain weather, it changed faster than a politician's promises. By mid-morning, the first flakes started falling. They were small and dry, the kind that blew around instead of sticking, but Elias knew what was coming. He'd seen it before, had nearly died in a blizzard outside Fort Laramie back in '68. The memory of that white wall of wind and snow, the way it sucked the warmth right out of you and turned the world into a howling void, that memory had kept him respectful of winter ever since. Buster plodded on, head down, apparently unconcerned. The donkey had his own thick winter coat coming in, and he trusted Elias to get them somewhere safe. That trust was a weight Elias carried, same as he carried the memory of his family. It meant something, being responsible for another life, even if that life had 4 legs and a stubborn streak. The trail narrowed as they climbed, the forest pressing in on both sides. Snow was falling steadily now, starting to accumulate on the pine boughs and on the trail itself. Elias pulled his hat down lower and wrapped his scarf tighter around his face. His fingers were getting cold even through his gloves, and he flexed them on the reins to keep the blood flowing. He thought about Hope's End again, wondered if maybe he should reconsider his plan to bypass it. A warm barn, even just for one night, would be welcome. A hot meal that he didn't have to cook himself. Maybe some conversation with folks who wouldn't ask too many questions about where he'd been or where he was going. But towns meant complications. They meant people who'd want to know his business, who'd maybe recognize him from his cavalry days, or from one of the many places he'd worked and left behind. They meant sheriffs, who sometimes had old wanted posters in their drawers, not necessarily for him, but for men who looked enough like him to cause trouble. They meant the possibility of attachment, of staying too long, of forgetting why he kept moving in the first place. No, better to push through, get over the pass, and make camp on the other side. The storm might be bad, but he'd weathered bad before. Except the storm had other ideas. By noon, the snow was falling so thick that Elias could barely see Buster's hindquarters from his seat on the wagon. The wind had picked up to a steady roar, driving the snow horizontal, piling it in drifts across the trail. The temperature had plummeted, and despite his heavy coat and scarf, Elias could feel the cold working its way into his bones. He'd already made the decision to stop, find some shelter, and wait it out when Buster made the decision for him. The donkey simply stopped walking, planted his feet, and refused to move. "Come on, boy," Elias called over the wind. "Just a little further. We'll find a spot to hunker down." But Buster didn't budge. He stood there in the harness, snow accumulating on his back, his ears flat against his head. And then he did something strange. He lowered his head and started nosing at a snowbank to the left of the trail, pushing his muzzle deep into the drift, snorting and pawing with one front hoof. Elias had learned a long time ago to trust Buster's instincts. The donkey had better senses than any human, could smell water or predators or danger before Elias had any clue. So instead of arguing, he climbed down from the wagon, his boots sinking into snow that was already ankle-deep, and made his way to where Buster was digging. At first he thought maybe the donkey smelled a dead animal, or maybe just wanted to dig for some reason only a donkey would understand. But Buster was insistent, almost frantic, and that wasn't like him. So Elias started digging too. His hands hit fabric first, then something solid beneath it. He dug faster, pulling away armfuls of snow, and then he saw it a hand, pale and still, fingers curled like claws. "Jesus," Elias breathed, and dug harder. It was a woman. She was curled on her side in the snow, wearing a thin dress and shawl that were completely inadequate for the weather. Her lips were blue, her skin alabaster white, and for a terrible moment Elias thought she was already gone. But when he pressed his fingers to her neck, he felt it a pulse, faint and slow, but there, she was alive, barely. Elias's mind raced through his options, all of them bad. If he stopped to help her, they'd all 3 likely freeze before the storm passed. The temperature was still dropping, the wind was getting worse, and he had maybe an hour of daylight left, though you couldn't tell it through the snow. If he tried to load her in the wagon and push on, Buster wouldn't make it. The donkey was already exhausted, and the trail ahead would only get worse. But if he left her, she'd be dead within the hour. Maybe less. It wasn't really a choice. Not for Elias. He'd spent too many years watching people die, from cholera and bullets, and the 100 other ways the West could kill you. He'd held his own daughters as the fever took them, had felt their small hands go cold in his. He couldn't save them, but maybe he could save this woman, whoever she was. He gathered her in his arms. She weighed almost nothing, all bones and cold skin, and carried her to the wagon. She didn't wake, didn't make a sound. Her breathing was so shallow he had to watch carefully to see her chest rise and fall. Moving fast now, Elias pulled out his buffalo robes and wrapped her in all three of them, creating a cocoon of warmth, or what would be warmth, if her body could generate any heat at all. He rubbed her hands, her arms, trying to get the blood moving, but her skin stayed cold as marble. He needed fire, needed it fast. But building a fire in this wind would be nearly impossible. The snow was coming down so thick now that he could barely see 10 feet in any direction. They needed shelter, real shelter, not just a tarp strung between trees. Elias looked at his wagon, at the life he'd built on wheels, and made another choice he knew he'd regret. The wagon had been with him for 8 years. He'd bought it off a widow in Santa Fe, patched it up, made it his home. It carried everything he owned, which admittedly wasn't much, but it was his. Breaking it down felt like cutting off a limb. But timber was timber, and they needed heat more than they needed transportation. He unhitched Buster first, led him to a spot where the pines grew thick enough to provide some windbreak, and hobbled him there. The donkey gave him a long look, as if to say he understood what was about to happen and approved. Then Elias went to work on the wagon. He started with the cover, pulling it off and using it to create a makeshift lean-to against a massive fallen log he'd spotted nearby. The canvas was heavy and stiff with ice, but it would block some of the wind. Then he began breaking down the wagon itself, the sideboard first, then the seat, using his hatchet to split the wood into manageable pieces. Each swing of the hatchet felt like a small betrayal, but he didn't stop. By the time he had enough wood gathered, his hands were numb and his whole body was shaking with cold. He'd given his heavy sheepskin coat to wrap around the woman, layering it over the buffalo robes, and his lighter jacket wasn't enough. Not in this wind. Not with the temperature still falling. Building the fire took 4 tries, and the last of his waterproof matches. The wind kept blowing out the kindling, and his hands were shaking so badly he could barely strike the match against the box. But finally, a small flame caught, fed on the dry splinters he'd carved from the wagon boards, and began to grow. Elias fed it carefully, adding larger pieces as the flames strengthened, building it up until he had a proper fire crackling under the lean-to. The heat felt like a physical thing, a presence that pushed back against the cold and wind. He moved the woman closer, keeping the buffalo robes wrapped tight around her, but letting the warmth reach her face. Only then did he really look at her. She was probably in her early 40s, though the hardness of frontier life could age a woman fast, same as it did a man. Her hair was dark brown, streaked with grey, and tangled with ice and pine needles. Her face was thin, fine-boned, with lines around her eyes that spoke of laughter and worry in equal measure. There was something refined about her features, something that suggested she hadn't always lived the kind of rough life that got you abandoned in a blizzard. As Elias arranged her closer to the fire, something fell from the folds of her dress, a small leather pouch, worn smooth with age and use. He picked it up, felt its weight, and caught the scent of something herbal and earthy, even through his cold, numbed nose. Medicine bag, he thought. Healer's bag. He set it aside carefully and turned his attention back to keeping them alive. The night that followed was the longest of Elias's life, and he'd lived through some long nights. He kept the fire going, feeding it piece by piece from his sacrificed wagon, watching the flames consume his home and turn it into heat and light. He melted snow for water, tried to get some of it into the woman's mouth, though most of it just dribbled down her chin. He checked her pulse every hour, felt her breathing, watched for any sign of consciousness. Mostly, though, he thought about the kind of people who would throw a woman out into a blizzard to die. Because that's clearly what had happened. This wasn't someone who'd gotten lost or separated from a party. She was dressed for indoors, not travel. She had no supplies, no horse, no way to survive even an hour in these conditions. Someone had brought her up here and left her. Had probably counted on the storm to cover their tracks, to make it look like she'd just wandered off and gotten lost in the white. Murder. That's what it was, even if they'd let the weather do the actual killing. Elias felt anger building in his chest, hot and bitter. He'd seen a lot of ugly things in his time, men shot over card games, Indians massacred for being in the wrong place, women and children dead from diseases that could have been prevented with clean water and basic care. But there was something particularly cruel about this, about leaving someone to freeze alone in the dark. Somewhere around midnight, the woman stirred. Her eyelids fluttered, and she made a small sound, barely more than a whimper. Elias leaned closer, speaking softly. "You're safe now. You're by a fire. Can you hear me?" Her eyes opened, unfocused and confused. They were brown, he noticed, dark as coffee. She tried to speak, but only a whisper came out, too soft to hear over the wind. "Don't try to talk," Elias said. "Just rest. Save your strength." But she was insistent, reaching out with one hand to grab his arm. Her grip was weak, but desperate. She tried again, and this time he caught a few words. "They said which had to leave." "Shh," Elias soothed. "That doesn't matter now. You just focus on staying warm." Her eyes searched his face, looking for something understanding, maybe, or judgment. Whatever she saw there must have satisfied her, because she relaxed back against the buffalo robes and closed her eyes again. But her hand stayed on his arm, as if she needed that connection to know she wasn't alone. Elias sat with her through the night, feeding the fire, keeping watch, and thinking about witches and the kind of fear that made people commit murder. He'd heard stories, of course. Women accused of witchcraft because they knew herbs, because they could ease pain or bring down fevers, because they had knowledge that looked like magic to folks who didn't understand it. Some communities tolerated their healers with a mixture of gratitude and suspicion. Others drove them out, or worse. Apparently, Hope's End was one of the worst kind. As the sky began to lighten, though you could barely tell through the snow, which was still falling thick and heavy, Elias made another decision. When this storm passed, they weren't going around Hope's End. They were going straight through it. And the people who'd tried to kill this woman were going to see exactly what kind of mercy they'd shown. The woman, he still didn't know her name, was sleeping now, her breathing deeper and more regular. Her skin had lost some of that deathly pallor, and when he checked her hands, they were actually warm to the touch. She'd make it. They both would. Buster stood nearby under the pines, snow piled on his back, watching the proceedings with his usual stoic patience. The donkey had saved her life by refusing to move, by insisting on investigating that snowbank. Animals knew things sometimes that people didn't. They could sense what was right, what was necessary. Elias added more wood to the fire and settled in to wait for dawn and whatever came after. The storm broke sometime around mid-morning, the wind dying down to occasional gusts and the snow thinning to scattered flakes. The world that emerged was transformed, everything buried under 3 feet of fresh powder, the pines bowed under the weight, the sky a pale grey that hurt to look at. The woman woke properly when the sun finally showed itself, a weak disk behind the clouds. Elias watched her eyes open, saw awareness flood back into them, along with fear and confusion. She sat up quickly, too quickly, and nearly collapsed from the effort. "Easy," Elias said, putting a hand on her shoulder. "You've been through quite an ordeal." She looked around at the fire, at the remains of his wagon scattered nearby, at Buster standing patient under the trees, and finally at Elias himself. Her hand went immediately to her dress, patting it, searching for something. "Your medicine bag," Elias said, holding it out to her. "It fell out last night. I didn't look inside." Relief washed over her face as she took it, clutching it to her chest like it was more precious than gold. "Maybe it was. Thank you," she whispered, her voice hoarse and rough. "Thank you for that. And for—" She gestured at the fire, the buffalo robe still wrapped around her, the shelter he'd built. "Name's Elias Cole," he said. "And you're welcome." "Sarah Brennan." She coughed, winced, and accepted the tin cup of melted snow water he offered. She drank it slowly, carefully, like someone who'd learned the hard way that rushing leads to sickness. When she was done, she looked at him with those dark eyes and asked. It was a simple question with a complicated answer. Why had he stopped? Why had he risked his life, destroyed his wagon, given up his warmth and shelter for a stranger? Elias had asked himself the same question through the long night, between feeding the fire and checking her pulse. Seemed like the right thing to do, he said finally. It was the truth, even if it wasn't the whole truth. Sarah studied him for a long moment, then nodded slowly. Most men wouldn't have, especially not when they heard what Hope's End said about me. They said you were a witch. They said I was in league with the devil himself. Her voice was steady, but Elias could hear the hurt underneath. Said my remedies and tinctures were dark magic. Said I'd cursed the Miller boy when he died of fever despite my best efforts. Said I'd brought evil into their town by practicing the old ways. And had you? Sarah's laugh was bitter and dry. I'd healed more people in that town than I'd buried. Set broken bones, delivered babies, eased the dying. My grandmother taught me about plants, about which roots ease pain and which bark brings down fever. That's not witchcraft, Mr. Cole. That's just knowledge. But knowledge in a woman's hands looks like sorcery to frightened men. Elias fed more wood to the fire, thinking about fear and what it made people do. He'd seen fear turn soldiers into murderers, seen it turn neighbors into enemies. Fear was maybe the most dangerous thing in the world, more dangerous than any bullet or blade. Who brought you up here? He asked. The town council, Mayor Hutchins, Sheriff Rawlings, and 4 other men whose bread I'd baked and whose children I'd tended. Her hands tightened on the medicine bag. They came to my house 3 nights ago, just after sunset, said I had until morning to leave Hope's End. I told them I had nowhere to go, that I'd lived there for 5 years, that I'd done nothing wrong. They said if I was still there at dawn, they'd burn my house with me in it. So you left. I left. Started walking north, thought maybe I could reach the trading post at Copper Creek, but the storm came up fast, and I'm not a young woman anymore, Mr. Cole. I got maybe 5 miles before I couldn't feel my feet, couldn't see the trail. I remember thinking I should sit down just for a minute, just to rest my legs. She looked down at her hands. That's the last thing I remember until I woke up by your fire. Elias was quiet for a moment, watching the flames. Your husband? Family? My husband died 4 years ago. Pneumonia. I have no children, no family within 300 miles. That's probably why they thought they could get away with it. No one to ask questions, no one to come looking. She met his eyes. Except a drifter with a donkey who was too stubborn to know he should mind his own business. Buster's the stubborn one, Elias said, nodding toward the donkey. He's the one who found you. Wouldn't move until I dug you out. Sarah looked at Buster with something like wonder. Then, I owe my life to both of you. The storm's passed. You could leave me here with a bit of food and water, take your donkey, and be on your way. No one would blame you. I'd blame me, Elias said. Besides, we're going to Hope's End. Sarah's eyes went wide. You can't. They'll say I bewitched you, or that you're in league with me. They might try to kill you too. Let them try. Elias's voice was flat, hard. You said you lived there 5 years. You got property? House? I did. I don't know if it's still standing. Then we're going to get your property back, and your good name if we can. Mr. Cole. Elias, you don't understand what you're dealing with. Mayor Hutchins has the whole town in his pocket. He's been running Hope's End like his personal kingdom since it was founded. The sheriff does whatever Hutchins says. And the people, they're good people, most of them, but they're scared. When Hutchins says jump, they ask how high. People are scared everywhere, Elias said. That doesn't give them the right to commit murder. Sarah pulled the buffalo robes tighter around herself. What makes you think you can change their minds? One man and a woman they think is a witch? Elias reached into his coat pocket and pulled out something he'd been carrying for longer than he cared to remember, a small leather case, worn smooth with age. He opened it to show Sarah what was inside, a daguerreotype, the image faded but still clear enough. 2 little girls with dark curls smiling at the camera, and a woman with kind eyes standing behind them. My wife Margaret and our daughters, Anna and Elizabeth, he said quietly. Cholera took them in 73. I couldn't save them. Couldn't do a damned thing but watch them die. He closed the case, his thumb running over the worn leather. You know what kills more people than bullets or Indians or accidents? Ignorance. Plain ignorance. If that fort had a proper doctor, someone who understood quarantine and sanitation and maybe some of what you know about healing, my girls might still be alive. He looked at Sarah, and she saw something in his eyes that made her understand this wasn't just about her anymore. This was about every person who died because knowledge was treated like witchcraft, because healing was confused with evil, because fear was stronger than sense. So no, ma'am, I don't know if I can change their minds, but I know I'm going to try. Because if I don't, the next time someone gets sick in Hope's End, more people are going to die. Maybe kids. Maybe someone's daughters. Sarah was quiet for a long time, her fingers tracing the edge of her medicine bag. Finally she nodded. All right, we'll go to Hope's End. But Elias, when they turn on us, and they will turn on us, you need to promise me something. What's that? You'll save yourself. Don't die for me. Don't let them kill you, trying to defend someone they've already condemned. Elias smiled, though there wasn't much humor in it. I'll make you a deal. I'll try to keep us both alive, but I'm not making any promises about leaving you behind. Fair enough? Sarah smiled back, and this time there was warmth in it. Fair enough. They spent the rest of that day preparing for the journey down to Hope's End. Sarah's strength was returning slowly, but she was still weak from her ordeal. Elias made her rest by the fire while he salvaged what he could from the broken wagon, his rifle, the revolver and ammunition, the supplies that hadn't been burned or scattered. It wasn't much. Most of his worldly possessions had gone up in smoke to keep them alive. He didn't regret it, but he couldn't help feeling the loss. A man's belongings might not seem like much to someone with a house full of furniture and closets full of clothes, but when everything you owned fit in a wagon, each item carried weight beyond its practical use. That tin cup had been his father's. That bedroll had seen him through 100 camps. That rifle had saved his life more than once. But they were just things. Sarah was alive, and that counted for more. By late afternoon, Elias had rigged up a sort of travois using pine poles and what was left of the wagon canvas. Buster could pull it, and Sarah could ride on it, wrapped in the buffalo robes. It wasn't comfortable, but it would get them down the mountain. As he worked, Sarah watched him with quiet attention. Eventually she spoke up. "You were cavalry." It wasn't a question. Elias glanced at her, then back at the knots he was tying. "Long time ago. The way you move, the way you set up camp, build a fire, organize your supplies, that's military training. Cavalry scout, served 7 years, mostly in Arizona territory." He pulled a knot tight, tested its strength. "You're pretty observant. You learn to be observant when your survival depends on reading people," Sarah said. "When I first started practicing healing, I was maybe 17 years old. My grandmother had just passed, and suddenly I was the one people came to with their ailments and injuries. I had to learn quick how to tell who was really sick and who was imagining things, who'd follow my instructions and who'd ignore them, who'd pay me and who'd try to cheat me. Sounds like you've had some practice with people trying to take advantage." Sarah smiled, though it was edged with sadness. "More than once, but most people are decent when you give them a chance. They're just scared of what they don't understand. Your average farmer or shopkeeper, they see someone heal a wound with a poultice of herbs and honey, and they don't know if it's medicine or magic. The church says magic is devil's work, so they get confused, get frightened." Elias finished securing the travois and stood back to examine his work. It would hold. Hope's End has a church. 2 of them, Baptist and Methodist. They don't agree on much except that women shouldn't have knowledge men don't understand. She shifted position, wincing. "The ministers aren't bad men, really. Reverend Thomas actually defended me when the accusations first started, but when Mayor Hutchins pushed hard enough, even Thomas backed down. This Hutchins sounds like a piece of work. He's a bully with a badge of respectability, Sarah said flatly. Came to Hope's End with money no one knows from where, and no one asks. Bought up half the businesses in town, got himself elected mayor, and now he runs everything. If you want credit at the general store, you go through Hutchins. If you need a loan for seed or livestock, you ask Hutchins. If you have a dispute with a neighbor, you bring it to Hutchins. And the sheriff, Tom Rawlings, used to be a decent man from what I hear, but he's got a sick wife and 3 kids to feed, and Hutchins pays his salary. Tom does what he's told. Elias thought about that, about the kind of power one man could accumulate in a small town when no one stood up to him. He'd seen it before, men who turned into petty tyrants, who used fear and obligation to control everyone around them. They were worse than outlaws in some ways, because they hid their cruelty behind respectability and law. Why'd they really exile you? He asked. I mean the real reason, not the witchcraft nonsense. Sarah was quiet for a moment, staring into the fire. When she spoke, her voice was thoughtful, choosing words carefully. 6 weeks ago, Hutchins's daughter came to me. Mary, her name is, sweet girl, only 19. She was pregnant and terrified. Said her father would kill her if he found out, said the father of the baby had run off, said she didn't know what to do. You helped her. I gave her some pennyroyal tea, told her how much to drink, warned her it would be painful, made sure she understood what would happen. Sarah's hands twisted in her lap. I've done it before, for women who had no other choice. Is it a sin? Maybe. I don't know. But I know what happens to unmarried women with babies. They get cast out, or worse. I couldn't let that happen to Mary. Elias understood now. Hutchins found out. Someone told him. I don't know who. Maybe Mary confessed. Maybe someone saw her coming to my house. Either way, 2 weeks later the accusations started. Witchcraft, consorting with demons, cursing the town's children. All of it nonsense, but it gave Hutchins the excuse he needed to get rid of me without admitting what I'd really done. Which was give his daughter a choice. Sarah agreed. Can't have that in Hutchins's world. Can't have women making their own decisions, having their own knowledge. Better to call it witchcraft and be done with it. The sun was getting low now, what little of it they could see through the clouds. Elias helped Sarah onto the travois, made sure she was wrapped warm in the buffalo robes. She looked small there, fragile in a way that made him think of his daughters. But there was steel in her too, a core of strength that had kept her alive this long. We'll camp here tonight, he said. Start down at first light. Should reach Hope's End by tomorrow afternoon, if the trail's not too bad. And then we see about getting your house back. Sarah touched the medicine bag at her waist, her fingers tracing its familiar shape. Elias, there's something you should know. When I left, I took what I could carry in this bag, my most precious remedies, the ones my grandmother taught me to make. But I left something behind too, a journal. 40 years of knowledge about plants and healing, written down by my grandmother and me. Recipes, treatments, observations. It's hidden in a loose board under my bed. You want it back. I need it back. Without it, half of what I know dies with me. And if Hutchins finds it, well, he'd probably just burn it. All that knowledge, gone forever. Elias nodded slowly. Then we'll get it back. Journal, house, your good name, we'll get it all back, or we'll make sure they regret taking it from you. You really think we can? Elias looked at her, at this woman who'd survived being left to freeze, who'd spent her life healing others only to be called a witch for her troubles. He thought about his girls, about all the things he hadn't been able to protect them from. Maybe he couldn't change the past, but he could sure as hell do something about the present. I think we have to try, he said. The trail down from the pass was treacherous with new snow, but Buster took it slow and steady, his small hooves finding purchase where a horse would have slipped. Elias walked beside him, one hand on the travois, to keep it from sliding sideways on the steeper sections. Sarah lay quiet, conserving her strength, occasionally pointing out landmarks or warning about particularly bad stretches of trail. By noon they descended below the tree line, and the landscape opened up into rolling hills covered in aspen and pine. The sky had cleared to a brilliant blue, and the sun on the snow was so bright it hurt to look at. Elias could see smoke rising in the distance, Hope's End, still a few miles ahead. "We'll reach the settlement in about 2 hours," Sarah said. "There's a crossing over Willow Creek just before town. That's where they'll likely spot us first. There's usually someone there, fishing or checking traps." Good to know. Elias was already thinking tactically, the old cavalry instincts kicking in. Scout the terrain, identify choke points, know your escape routes. Not that he planned on running, but it paid to be prepared. They were passing through a grove of aspens when Buster suddenly stopped again, his ears going forward in that alert way that meant he'd noticed something. Elias held up a hand for silence and listened. At first he heard nothing but wind in the trees and the distant cry of a hawk. Then, faintly, he caught it, a child's voice, calling out, not in play, but in distress. "Help! Somebody help!" Elias tied off Buster's lead to a tree and moved toward the sound, his hand instinctively going to the revolver at his hip. Sarah called after him softly, "Be careful." He found the boy about 50 yards off the trail, down in a small ravine. The kid was maybe 8 years old, skinny as a rail, with dark hair and a face white with pain and fear. He was sitting in the snow, one leg bent at an angle that made Elias wince. Broken, no question. The boy looked up as Elias appeared, hope and terror warring on his face. "Mister, my leg, I fell." "Easy, son. I'm here to help." Elias slid down the ravine, his boots cutting tracks in the snow. "What's your name?" "Daniel. Daniel Hutchins." The boy's teeth were chattering, whether from cold or shock Elias couldn't tell. I was checking my rabbit snares when I slipped on some ice. Please. It hurts real bad." "Hutchins, the mayor's son, or maybe a nephew." Elias felt a cold satisfaction settle in his chest. Sometimes fate had a sense of irony. "All right, Daniel. I'm going to take a look, but I need you to be brave for me. Can you do that?" The boy nodded, tears streaming down his face. Elias examined the leg as gently as he could, clean break midway down the shin, but the bone hadn't broken through the skin. That was good. But the boy needed treatment soon, needed the bone set properly, or he'd end up with a leg that never healed right. "Sarah," Elias called up to the trail, "need you down here." There was a pause, then Sarah's voice, uncertain. "Elias, I don't know if... Boy's got a broken leg. I can't set it proper, need your help." Another pause, longer this time. Then he heard movement, heard Sarah making her way down the ravine, using tree branches to support herself. She was still weak, still recovering, but she came anyway. Daniel's eyes went wide when he saw her. You're the witch woman, the one they tried to kill," Sarah finished, her voice flat. "Yes, that's me." The boy looked between her and Elias, confusion and fear plain on his face. "But my pa said," he said, "you were evil, said you put curses on people." "Your pa said a lot of things that weren't true," Sarah said, kneeling beside him despite her obvious pain. "But right now, Daniel, your leg is broken, and if someone doesn't set it properly, you're going to be crippled for life. Your choice, let me help you, or wait here until someone else finds you. Might be hours, might be never." Daniel looked at his leg, at the unnatural angle, at the pain written clear on his own face. Then he looked at Sarah, really looked at her, and Elias saw something shift in the boy's eyes. Whatever he'd been told about witches and curses, it was hard to hold on to that when you were hurt and scared and someone was offering help. "Okay," Daniel whispered. "Please help me." Sarah opened her medicine bag and pulled out a small dark bottle. "This is laudanum. It'll help with the pain. Just a few drops." She measured it carefully into a bit of snow water and helped him drink it. Then she turned to Elias. "I need 2 straight branches, about so long," she indicated with her hands, "and something to bind them with." Elias cut the branches with his knife and tore strips from his spare shirt. Sarah worked with quiet efficiency, her hands steady despite her own weakness. She had Elias hold the boy's shoulders while she set the bone. Daniel screamed once, sharp and short, then bit down on the leather strap Elias had given him. When it was done, the leg was splinted straight and tight. Sarah wrapped it carefully, checking her work, making small adjustments. Elias watched her and thought about all the times she must have done this before, all the people she'd helped over the years. This was real knowledge, real skill. Anyone who called it witchcraft was a fool. "That should hold until you get to a proper doctor," Sarah said, sitting back on her heels. "Keep it elevated when you can. Don't put weight on it for at least 6 weeks. If it starts to smell bad or if you get a fever, you need to tell someone immediately." Daniel looked at her with something like awe. "Thank you, ma'am. Thank you so much." "You're welcome." Sarah's voice was soft. "When you see your father, Daniel, you tell him something for me. Tell him the witch he tried to freeze to death just saved his son's leg. And tell him I'm coming to Hope's End, and I'm not leaving until I get what's mine." The boy nodded slowly, understanding, maybe for the first time, that the story he'd been told and the reality in front of him didn't match up. Elias carried Daniel back to the trail and got him settled on the travois with Sarah. The boy was already drowsy from the laudanum, but he kept looking at Sarah with that same wondering expression, like he was trying to reconcile what he'd been taught with what he'd experienced. They continued down the trail toward Hope's End, and Elias couldn't help but feel that something had shifted. They had leverage now, proof that Sarah was exactly what she claimed to be, a healer, not a witch. Whether that would be enough to change minds in a town that had already made up its collective mind, well, that remained to be seen. But it was a start. They crossed Willow Creek just as Sarah had predicted, the water running fast and clear over rocks that clicked and rattled with the current. A man was there, checking a line of traps, and he looked up as they approached. His eyes went wide when he saw Sarah on the travois. "Dear God," he breathed, "she's alive." "That's right," Elias said evenly. "Alive? No thanks to your town council." The man, he looked to be in his 30s, with a weathered face and calloused hands, stared at them for a long moment. Then he saw Daniel, saw the splinted leg, and his expression changed. "That's the mayor's boy. What happened?" "Broke his leg. Sarah here set it for him." Elias kept walking, leading Buster forward. "Might want to run ahead, let folks know we're coming. Wouldn't want them to be surprised." The man didn't need to be told twice. He abandoned his traps and took off running toward town, his boots kicking up snow. "Well," Sarah said quietly, "that'll give them a few minutes to get a welcoming committee together." Hope's End appeared around a bend in the trail, and Elias got his first good look at it. The settlement was bigger than he'd expected, maybe 40 buildings clustered around a main street, with houses and farms spreading out into the valley beyond. There was a church with a white steeple, a general store with a false front, a saloon, a blacksmith's forge with smoke rising from the chimney. Normal little town, the kind you'd find scattered all over the frontier. Except this town had tried to murder the woman riding on his travois. People were already gathering as they entered the main street. They stood in doorways and on porches, their faces a mixture of shock, fear, and guilt. Elias could read a crowd after years of watching how people reacted to cavalry patrols riding into hostile territory. These folks were scared of what Sarah represented, but they were also ashamed. Good. Shame might give them pause before they tried anything stupid. A man stepped out into the street, hand resting on the gun at his hip. He wore a tin star on his vest, Sheriff Rawlings, Elias assumed. He was in his 40s, with grey in his beard and lines around his eyes that spoke of too many hard choices and not enough sleep. "That's far enough," Rawlings said, his voice carrying that practiced authority lawmen used to establish control. "You need to turn around and head back the way you came." Elias stopped Buster, but didn't step back. "We're not going anywhere, Sheriff. Sarah here is a resident of Hope's End. She's got property in this town, and she's come to reclaim it." Sarah Brennan was exiled for practicing witchcraft and endangering this community, Rawlings said, though his voice lacked conviction. "She's not welcome here." "That's so." Elias gestured to Daniel, who was awake now and watching the proceedings with wide eyes. "Because seems to me she just saved your mayor's son from losing his leg. Found him in a ravine with a broken bone, set it proper, kept him from going into shock. That sound like witchcraft to you, Sheriff?" Rawlings's eyes flicked to Daniel, and Elias saw doubt there. "Good. Doubt was a crack in the armor." "That true, Daniel?" Rawlings asked. The boy nodded. "Yes, sir. I fell, checking my snares, broke my leg real bad. This man and Miss Brennan found me. She fixed it, gave me medicine for the pain and everything." A murmur ran through the crowd. Elias could see them processing this information, trying to reconcile it with what they'd been told. A woman pushed through to the front, young, pretty, her face tight with anxiety. She ran to the travois and gathered Daniel into her arms. "Oh, thank God, she sobbed. "I thought when you didn't come home." She looked up at Sarah, tears streaming down her face. Thank you for saving my boy." Sarah's expression was carefully neutral. "Any healer would have done the same, Mrs. Hutchins." The woman flinched at the name, and Elias understood. This was the mayor's wife, Daniel's mother. She'd been there in town when they'd exiled. Sarah had probably stood silent while her husband condemned a woman to death. And now that same woman had saved her son. "Where's the mayor?" Elias asked quietly. "Right here." The crowd parted, and a man strode forward. James Hutchins looked every inch the successful frontier businessman, tall, well-fed, wearing a suit that probably cost more than most people in Hope's End, made in a month. He had a thick moustache and eyes that were cold and calculating, the kind of eyes that saw people as tools or obstacles, never as individuals. He looked at Sarah on the travois, and Elias saw no guilt there, no shame, just irritation, at an inconvenience that should have been handled. "I don't know how you survived," Hutchins said flatly, "but you're not staying. You were cast out legally, by vote of the council. That decision stands." "Your son would disagree," Elias said, his voice hard. "Seems he's mighty grateful to the woman you tried to freeze to death." Hutchins glanced at Daniel, and something flickered across his face, not quite concern, but close. "I'm grateful she helped my boy. That doesn't change what she is, or what she did." "And what exactly did she do?" Elias asked, loud enough for everyone to hear. "Heal people? Deliver babies? Ease suffering? Or did she commit the real crime of knowing things you don't understand, of being a woman with knowledge and independence?" "She practices dark arts. She practices medicine." Elias cut him off. "Your own son just benefited from that medicine. You want to condemn her for witchcraft? Fine. But first, you explain to everyone here how witchcraft managed to set a broken bone better than any doctor could." The crowd was muttering now, louder. Elias could see the cracks forming in their certainty. These were decent people, most of them. They'd been scared, had been led by a man who used their fear to maintain control. But now they were seeing the truth, and the truth had a way of cutting through lies. Hutchins's face darkened. "Sheriff, arrest these two. Charge them with disturbing the peace, resisting lawful exile, whatever you need to charge them with." Rawlings didn't move. He was looking at Sarah, at Daniel, at his own boots. "Jim, maybe we should—" "I said, arrest them." "No." The voice came from the crowd, strong and clear. A woman stepped forward, older, grey-haired, wearing a simple dress and apron. "No more, James. I won't stand for it." Other voices joined hers. "She saved Daniel. She's never hurt anyone." Hutchins's control was slipping, and Elias could see the man's rage building. Bullies didn't like being challenged, especially not in public, especially not by the people they were used to dominating. "You're all fools." Hutchins spat. She's got you under her spell already. This is exactly why we had to get rid of her. She turns good people against each other, makes you question what you know to be true." "What we know to be true," Sarah said, speaking for the first time since they'd entered town, "is that I've spent 5 years helping this community. I've delivered 12 babies, set countless bones, treated fevers and wounds and illnesses. I've asked for nothing but fair payment and basic respect. And you repaid me by leaving me to die in a blizzard." Her words hung in the air, and the silence that followed was profound. Even Hutchins seemed at a loss for a moment. Then, from one of the houses at the edge of town, came a sound that changed everything, a child's cough, wet and harsh and desperate. Then another cough, and another, as if the first had awakened a chorus. A woman ran out of one of the houses, her face white with terror. "Dr. Morrison! Someone get Dr. Morrison! It's Emma, she can't breathe!" The crowd fractured, people running toward their homes. Sudden panic replacing the tension of the confrontation. Elias heard more coughing now, coming from multiple houses, and underneath it the high-pitched wheeze of children struggling to draw breath. Dr. Morrison appeared from the direction of the church, a portly man in his 60s with white hair and trembling hands. He looked harried, exhausted, like he'd been up all night. "How many?" he called to the crowd. "6 that we know of," someone answered. "Maybe more. Started last night." Sarah sat up straighter on the travois, her healer's instincts overriding her exhaustion. "What are the symptoms?" she called out. Morrison looked at her, and Elias saw recognition flash across his face, followed by something that looked like relief. High fever, sore throat, grey membrane forming in the throat and nose. "The children can barely breathe." He paused. "It's diphtheria, the strangling angel." The words hit the crowd like a physical blow. Elias had heard of diphtheria, had seen it once during his cavalry days. It killed children fast, choking them on their own swollen tissue. Without treatment, the mortality rate was high, maybe 50%, maybe more. "How many children total in Hope's End?" Sarah asked, her voice steady despite the gravity of the situation. 23, Morrison said, most of them under 10 years old. Sarah closed her eyes briefly, and Elias saw her making calculations, running through what she knew. When she opened them again, she looked at Morrison directly. "Do you have any antitoxin? Any diphtheria treatments?" "Nothing," Morrison admitted, and Elias heard the defeat in his voice. "We're 3 days from the nearest hospital, 4 days from any pharmacy that might stock antitoxin. By the time we could get it here—" He didn't finish the sentence. He didn't have to. "I can help," Sarah said. She reached for her medicine bag, pulled it close. "There's a treatment. Not a cure, but it can help reduce the membrane, ease the breathing, buy time for their bodies to fight the infection." Hutchins pushed forward, his face red with anger. "You're not touching those children. You're a witch, and I won't have you." "James, shut up." It was Morrison who spoke, his voice sharp with authority. "I'm a trained physician, and I'm telling you right now that without treatment, half those children will be dead by morning. Sarah knows things I don't, knows remedies that work. If she says she can help, I believe her." "It's a trick," Hutchins insisted. "She probably caused this plague herself, just so she could swoop in and—" "Diphtheria doesn't work that way," Morrison snapped. "It's a disease, not a curse. It spreads through contact, through breathing the same air. Could have come from anywhere, a trader, a traveler, someone visiting from another town. But it's here now, and it's killing children, and I don't care if the devil himself has the cure, I'm going to use it." The crowd was silent, watching this confrontation. Elias could see mothers clutching their shawls, fathers with fear written plain on their faces. The mayor's political power meant nothing when their children were choking to death. Sarah addressed the crowd directly. "I need to be clear about something. What I can make will help with the symptoms. It won't cure the disease, only time, and the body's own defenses can do that. But it can reduce the swelling, make it easier to breathe, buy precious time. I've seen it work before, back in Virginia before I came west. But I need certain ingredients, and I need them quickly." "What do you need?" Morrison asked. "Wild cherry bark, slippery elm, lobelia, mullein, and honey, lots of honey." She looked around the crowd. "The plants grow in these mountains, but I'd need to gather them fresh, and that would take hours we don't have. Unless," she hesitated, "unless my house is still standing and my stores are intact." An uncomfortable silence fell. Finally, Sheriff Rawlings spoke up. "Your house is still there, Sarah. We didn't burn it. Couldn't quite bring ourselves to, I suppose." "Is it locked?" "No, ma'am." Sarah looked at Elias, and he understood what she needed. "Sheriff, I'm going to Sarah's house to retrieve her medical supplies. Anyone tries to stop me, there's going to be trouble. Are we clear?" Rawlings nodded slowly. "You'll need help carrying everything. I'll come with you." Hutchins stepped in front of them. "I forbid this. I'm the mayor of this town, and I won't allow—" "Get out of the way, James." It was his wife who spoke, still holding Daniel close. Her voice was quiet but firm. "You let your pride kill our son's playmates. You let it kill the children I've watched grow up, and I'll never forgive you." Sarah saved Daniel. Now she's offering to save the others. "I don't care what you call it, witchcraft, medicine, divine intervention. I just care that it works." Other voices joined hers. The tide had turned completely now, and Hutchins knew it. He stepped aside, his face a mask of impotent fury, but he stepped aside. Elias helped Sarah to her feet. She was shaky, still weak, but determined. "I should come with you," she said. "I need to show you where everything is, how to identify the different ingredients." "You need to rest," Elias countered. "Tell me what to look for, and I'll find it. Some of these herbs look similar to poisonous plants. One mistake could kill instead of heal." Morrison cleared his throat. "I could go with him. I know basic botany, enough to help identify the right plants." Sarah nodded reluctantly. "All right. My house is the blue one at the end of Oak Street, the one with the herb garden in front. Inside, on the shelves in the kitchen, you'll find glass jars labeled with the plant names. I need—" She rattled off a list of ingredients, making Morrison repeat them back to ensure he had them right. As Elias, Morrison, and Rawlings headed toward Sarah's house, another woman approached Sarah, the older one who'd spoken up earlier. "Come to my house, dear. You can rest there, have some hot tea, get your strength back. You're going to need it." Sarah looked at the woman, saw genuine kindness there, and nodded. "Thank you, Mrs. Abernathy, Rose Abernathy. And I owe you an apology, Sarah. We all do. We let fear rule us, let one man's hatred turn us into cowards. That ends today." Sarah's house was exactly as she'd described it, small, neat, with a garden out front that had been neglected but was still recognizable as an herb plot. Inside, it was simple but comfortable, the kind of home that spoke of someone who lived alone but took pride in their space. The kitchen was where she kept her medicine. Dozens of jars lined the shelves, each carefully labeled in a neat hand. Wild cherry bark, slippery elm, lobelia, mullein. Elias and Morrison gathered what Sarah had specified, and Morrison's eyes widened at the organization, the careful preservation of each ingredient. "She's been doing this for decades," Morrison said quietly. "Look at this proper storage, clear labeling, notes on dosage and preparation. This isn't witchcraft. This is science, passed down through generations of healers." "Hutchins knew that," Rawlings said from the doorway. He'd been standing guard watching the street. He knew she was just a healer, but he needed her gone. And witchcraft was the excuse that worked. "Why?" Elias asked. "What did she do that threatened him so much?" Rawlings was quiet for a moment. "Helped his daughter. Girl got herself in trouble, and Sarah helped her out of it. Hutchins couldn't stand the idea that someone had that kind of knowledge, that kind of power, that he couldn't control. So he eliminated the threat by trying to kill her." "By trying to kill her," Rawlings agreed, and Elias heard the shame in his voice. "I went along with it, told myself it was legal, that the council had voted, that I was just doing my job." But I knew we were murdering an innocent woman, and I did it anyway. Elias looked at the sheriff, saw a man confronting his own cowardice. You can't undo what's done, but you can stand with her now. Make sure she's protected while she treats those kids. I will. You have my word on that. They gathered the ingredients and headed back to the center of town. Sarah was waiting in Mrs. Abernathy's house, looking slightly better after some hot tea and rest. Morrison showed her what they'd collected, and she examined each jar carefully, nodding her approval. This should be enough, she said, but I'll need a workspace, somewhere clean with boiling water and proper utensils. And I'll need to see each child, assess their condition, determine the right dosage. Use my kitchen, Mrs. Abernathy offered. I'll help however I can. Sarah looked around at the faces, watching her, the same people who'd stood by while she was exiled, who'd let their fear be weaponized against her. But she also saw their children, heard their desperate coughing, knew that innocents were suffering. All right, she said quietly, let's get to work. Mrs. Abernathy's kitchen became a makeshift apothecary. Sarah worked with quiet efficiency, measuring herbs into a large pot of boiling water, adding honey, stirring until the mixture reached the right consistency. She explained each step to Morrison, who watched with the focused attention of a student learning from a master. The wild cherry bark reduces inflammation, Sarah said, her hands steady despite her exhaustion. Slippery elm coats and soothes the throat. Lobelia helps relax the muscles that are constricting the airway. And the honey well. Honey is nature's own medicine, antibacterial, soothing, and sweet enough that even sick children will take it. How did you learn all this? Morrison asked. My grandmother. She learned from her grandmother, who learned from hers. Knowledge passed down through the women in my family for generations. Sarah stirred the pot, watching the herbs steep. In the old country they called women like us wise women. Here they call us witches. Different words, same fear. Elias stood by the door, his revolver visible on his hip, watching the street. He'd positioned himself between Sarah and any potential threat, and he wasn't moving until this was done. Several townspeople had gathered outside, watching nervously, waiting for word on their children. The first child Sarah treated was Emma, the little girl who'd started the panic. She was 6 years old, with blonde curls, matted with sweat, and eyes glazed with fever. The grey membrane in her throat was clearly visible when Sarah examined her, and the sound of her breathing was like wind through a broken pipe, ragged, whistling, desperate. Emma's mother hovered nearby, wringing her hands. Is she going to die? Sarah didn't offer false comfort. I don't know. The disease has progressed far, but this medicine will help her breathe easier, and that gives her body a chance to fight. She administered the treatment carefully, a spoonful at a time, letting Emma swallow slowly. The child grimaced at the taste despite the honey, but Sarah's gentle encouragement kept her taking it. Within minutes, Emma's breathing began to ease slightly. Not cured, not by a long shot, but better. Keep giving her this every 4 hours, Sarah instructed the mother. Small sips of water when she can manage it. Keep her cool if the fever spikes. And watch for any changes. If she gets worse, send for me immediately. They moved to the next house, then the next. Each child received the same careful attention, the same precise dosage, the same clear instructions to their parents. Sarah moved through Hope's End like she'd never left, greeting people by name, remembering details about their families, showing the kind of care that came from genuine connection to a community. Elias watched the townspeople watch her, saw the shame and guilt on their faces, growing with each child she treated. These were the people who'd stood silent when Hutchins ordered her exiled. These were the mothers and fathers who'd let fear override their judgment, who'd condemned a healer because they didn't understand healing. And now that healer was saving their children. By late afternoon, Sarah had treated all 6 of the confirmed cases. Dr. Morrison accompanied her to each house, learning her methods, asking questions, taking notes in a small leather journal he carried. The transformation in the old physician was remarkable. He'd gone from exhausted and hopeless to engaged and energized, his hands no longer trembling now that he had direction and purpose. "You should have been the town doctor," Morrison said, as they walked back to Mrs. Abernathy's house. "You know more about practical healing than I learned in 4 years of medical school." "Different kinds of knowledge," Sarah said diplomatically. "You understand anatomy, disease processes, surgical techniques. I understand plants and traditional remedies. We could have complemented each other, worked together to help this community." "We still can," Morrison said firmly. "Once this is over, once these children are well, I'm going to make sure everyone knows what you've done, and I'm going to propose to the council that you be recognized as Hope's End's official herbalist and midwife." Sarah smiled, but it was tinged with sadness. "That's a kind thought, Doctor, but I don't think the council, or at least one member of it, is going to agree." As if summoned by the mention, Mayor Hutchins appeared at the end of the street. He wasn't alone. He'd gathered a group of men, maybe 8 or 10 of them, and they looked agitated, angry. Elias's hand moved to his revolver. "Sarah, get inside." "No." Her voice was quiet but firm. "I'm done hiding from bullies." Hutchins and his group approached, and Elias stepped forward to meet them, putting himself between them and Sarah. The mayor's face was red, whether from anger or the cold, Elias couldn't tell. "This ends now," Hutchins announced. "You've had your fun playing Dr. Brennan, but it's time for you to leave. Sheriff, I want her arrested for what, exactly?" Rawlings had appeared from somewhere, stepping up beside Elias. "For healing sick children? For saving lives? For practicing medicine without a license? For—" "I have no license either, James," Morrison interrupted. "Out here on the frontier, we're lucky to have anyone with healing knowledge, licensed or not. Sarah's methods are sound, her treatments are working, and if you try to stop her, you'll have to go through me." "And me," said Mrs. Abernathy, stepping out of her house. "And me," said another voice, and another. People were emerging from houses, from the general store, from the church. The crowd that had once stood silent while Sarah was condemned was finding its voice. Hutchins looked around, saw his support crumbling, and his expression turned vicious. "You're all fools. She's got you under her spell, just like I warned. This sickness, she probably brought it here herself. Probably cursed those children just so she could swoop in and play savior. That's enough." The new voice was female, young, and shaking with emotion. A girl pushed through the crowd, pretty, dark-haired, maybe 19 years old. Elias recognized the resemblance to Hutchins immediately. This was Mary, the daughter Sarah had helped. "That's enough, Father," Mary repeated. "I won't let you do this anymore. I won't let you hurt Sarah because of what she did for me." Hutchins's face went pale. "Mary, be quiet. You don't know what you're saying." "I know exactly what I'm saying." Mary's voice was gaining strength, losing its tremor. "I know that when I was desperate and scared, Sarah helped me. She gave me a choice when you would have taken all my choices away. She treated me with kindness and respect, and you tried to kill her for it. She corrupted you. She saved me," Mary's shout echoed off the buildings. "And now she's saving the children of this town, the same town that left her to freeze to death. If that's witchcraft, then maybe we need more witches and fewer men like you." The crowd murmured its agreement. Hutchins looked around, saw his power slipping away like water through his fingers, and made a desperate grab to hold onto it. "Fine," he said, his voice tight with controlled fury. "You want to trust a witch with your children's lives? That's your choice. But when they start dying, when her potions and herbs fail, and the angel takes them anyway, remember that I warned you. Remember that I tried to protect you from her influence." He turned and stalked away, his supporters considerably fewer now trailing after him. But Elias watched him go with a sense of unease. Men like Hutchins didn't give up power easily. They adapted, changed tactics, looked for new angles of attack. This wasn't over. Sarah seemed to sense it too. She watched the mayor disappear around a corner, then turned to the crowd. "I need to check on the children again," she said. "Make sure the treatments are working. Adjust dosages if necessary, Mrs. Abernathy. May I continue using your kitchen as a workspace?" "For as long as you need, dear." The rest of the day passed in a blur of house calls and medicine preparation. Elias stayed close to Sarah, ever watchful, while Buster was stabled at the livery and fed properly for the first time in days. The townspeople brought them food, offered shelter, apologized with words and actions for their complicity in Sarah's exile. By evening, all 6 children showed improvement. The grey membranes were receding, the breathing easier, the fevers beginning to break. It was too soon to declare victory. Diphtheria could turn deadly again in hours, but it was progress, hope. Sarah collapsed into a chair in Mrs. Abernathy's parlour, finally allowing herself to rest. She looked drawn, exhausted, every one of her 40-some years visible in the lines of her face. But there was also satisfaction there, the quiet pride of someone who'd done good work against long odds. "You should sleep," Elias said gently. "You've been going since dawn, and you were half dead yourself just yesterday." "I will," Sarah promised. "But first I need to prepare more medicine for the night doses, and I should check the journal I left hidden here, make sure the dosages I'm using match what my grandmother recommended for children of different ages." "The journal under your bed?" "Yes." She looked at him, and something passed between them, an understanding, perhaps, of what that journal represented. "Would you retrieve it for me? My house is just down the street, and I'm not sure I can make the walk right now without falling on my face." "Of course." Elias took a lantern and headed out into the early evening. The street was quiet now, most people inside with their families, watching over sick children or simply grateful that their own were healthy. Lights glowed in windows, and smoke rose from chimneys into the darkening sky. Sarah's house was dark when he arrived. He let himself in, moved through the familiar layout to the bedroom. The bed was simple, neatly made despite having been abandoned for days. He knelt beside it, felt along the floorboards, until he found the loose one Sarah had described. The journal was there, wrapped in oilcloth to protect it from moisture. He pulled it out carefully, feeling the weight of accumulated knowledge in his hands. 40 years of healing, Sarah had said. 40 years of recipes and observations and wisdom, all written down so it wouldn't be lost. He was turning to leave when he heard the sound of footstep, deliberate and heavy, from the front room. Elias set down the lantern and drew his revolver in one smooth motion, the old cavalry reflexes taking over. He moved silently to the bedroom door, pressed himself against the wall, listened. More footsteps. Multiple people, trying to be quiet but not quite managing it. Low and familiar Mayor Hutchins. "Burn it all, the house, the garden, everything. I want no trace of her witchcraft left in this town." Elias heard the splash of kerosene, smelled it sharp and chemical in the air. They were going to burn Sarah's house with him, inside. Elias had maybe 30 seconds before they lit the fire. He could slip out the back, save himself and the journal, let them burn the house. But that would leave Hutchins free to try again, to threaten Sarah again, to keep wielding fear like a weapon against anyone who challenged his control. No, this ended tonight. He stepped out of the bedroom into the main room, his revolver raised and steady. 4 men stood there, frozen in the act of splashing kerosene on Sarah's furniture, on her shelves of carefully preserved medicines. Hutchins was by the door, a lit match in his hand. "Drop the match," Elias said quietly. "Step away from the door." Hutchins's eyes widened, then narrowed. The match burned down toward his fingers, but he didn't drop it. "You're trespassing in a condemned property. We're within our rights to dispose of it. Sarah's not dead. This property isn't condemned. You're attempting murder and arson, and I'm a witness." Elias kept the gun trained on Hutchins. "The other men, I'll give you 5 seconds to walk out that door and forget this ever happened. After that, you're accomplices to attempted murder." The 4 men looked at each other, at Hutchins, at the gun in Elias's hand. They'd probably thought this would be easy: splash some kerosene, light a match, walk away. They hadn't counted on resistance. One of them set down his kerosene tin and moved toward the door, then another. Within moments, only Hutchins remained, still holding that burning match, his face twisted with rage. "You've destroyed everything," Hutchins hissed. "I built this town. I brought order and prosperity, and you and that witch are tearing it all down." "You built this town on fear and control," Elias corrected. "That's not prosperity, that's tyranny. Someone has to lead, someone has to make the hard decisions. These people, they're sheep. They need someone strong to guide them, to protect them from their own weakness. Is that what you tell yourself?" Elias took a step closer, and Hutchins took a step back. "That you're protecting them by murdering a healer? By exiling a woman who's done nothing but help your community?" The match burned down to Hutchins's fingers. He dropped it with a curse, and it fell onto the kerosene-soaked floor. The flame caught, spread in a blue-orange line across the floorboards. Elias lunged forward, grabbed Hutchins by the collar, and threw him bodily out the front door. Then he turned to the fire, stomping on the flames with his boots, using his coat to smother the larger patches. The fire was small, still contained, feeding on the kerosene but not yet reaching the wood itself. He heard shouting outside, people responding to the smell of smoke, to Hutchins lying in the street. Elias kept working, kept fighting the fire, and within a minute others joined him. They brought buckets of water, blankets to smother the flames, shovels to scrape up the burning kerosene-soaked wood. Sarah pushed through the crowd, her face pale with shock when she saw her house, saw the scorch marks on the floor, smelled the kerosene. "Elias, are you hurt?" "I'm fine." He held up the journal, still clutched in his left hand throughout the firefighting. "Got what we came for." Sarah took it with trembling hands, pressed it to her chest. Then she looked at Hutchins, who was being held by Sheriff Rawlings and Dr. Morrison, and something in her expression changed. The fear and uncertainty that had lingered there since Elias first found her in the snow, it was gone. In its place was steel. "You tried to kill me twice," she said, her voice carrying across the silent crowd. "Once by exile in a blizzard, once by fire. Both times you failed. I think God is trying to tell you something, Mayor." "You're a witch," Hutchins spat. Though his voice had lost its authority, "this proves it. No natural woman could survive what you've survived." "I survived because good people helped me," Sarah said. "A drifter with a kind heart and a stubborn donkey. A doctor willing to learn. Neighbors who remembered that fear doesn't excuse cruelty. That's not witchcraft, James. That's humanity." She turned to address the crowd. "I know you're all scared. Disease is frightening. Change is frightening. Knowledge you don't understand is frightening. But fear makes us cruel. Fear makes us turn on our neighbors, burn down their homes, condemn them to death for the crime of being different." Sarah paused, let her words sink in. "I'm not asking you to stop being afraid. I'm asking you to be brave enough to act with kindness anyway, to choose understanding over suspicion, to trust that sometimes the strange and unfamiliar is simply another kind of good." The crowd was silent, absorbing this. Then Mrs. Abernathy stepped forward. "I move that we hold an emergency town meeting, that we vote to rescind Sarah Brennan's exile and formally apologize for the injustice done to her." "Seconded," said Dr. Morrison. "All in favor?" Mrs. Abernathy called. A forest of hands rose into the air. Not everyone. Elias saw some people keeping their arms down, saw doubt and fear still lingering, but the vast majority voted yes. Hutchins watched his power crumble completely, and something broke in him. He sagged in Rawlings's grip, suddenly looking old and tired. "What do we do with him?" Rawlings asked, still holding Hutchins. The sheriff's voice was uncertain. He'd spent so long taking orders that giving them felt foreign. Elias looked at Sarah. This was her decision to make, her justice to claim or grant. Sarah studied Hutchins for a long moment. The man who'd tried to kill her twice, who'd used her act of kindness toward his daughter as an excuse to destroy her life, who'd turned a community against her through manipulation and fear. She had every right to demand punishment, to see him jailed or run out of town the way he'd run her out. Instead, she said, "Let him go." The crowd murmured in surprise. Hutchins looked up, confusion replacing the defeat in his eyes. "Let him go," Sarah repeated, "but not as mayor, not as a leader. James Hutchins, you're removed from the town council, removed from any position of authority in Hope's End. You can stay as a private citizen, but you have no more power here. None. Is that clear?" Hutchins straightened slightly, seeming to find some fragment of his old arrogance. "You can't do that. I was elected." "You were elected to serve this community, Mrs." Abernathy cut in. "You've proven you serve only yourself. The council will meet tomorrow to make it official, but as far as I'm concerned, you're done." "I own half the businesses in this town," Hutchins protested. "I own the general store, the feed depot, the cells." "Then run them as businesses," Dr. Morrison said. "But you don't run the people anymore. That's over." Rawlings released Hutchins, who stood there in the middle of the street, stripped of the authority he'd wielded for so long. He looked smaller somehow, diminished. He opened his mouth to say something, a threat perhaps, or a final attempt at control, but then seemed to realize the futility of it. He turned and walked away, his shoulders hunched, heading toward his large house at the edge of town. His wife and son didn't follow. Mrs. Hutchins stood with Daniel, watching her husband go, and the relief on her face was visible even in the dim light. Mary had already disappeared, probably not wanting to witness her father's downfall, even though she'd helped precipitate it. "All right then, Mrs." Abernathy said briskly, taking charge in the sudden vacuum of leadership. "Let's get Sarah's house cleaned up properly, make sure there's no damage beyond the floor. And someone should check on the sick children, make sure they have enough medicine to get through the night." The crowd dispersed with purpose now, people moving to help instead of standing frozen by fear. Some went to fetch water and cleaning supplies for Sarah's house, others headed home to their own families. A few approached Sarah directly to offer apologies, to thank her for treating their children, to shake her hand and welcome her back. Elias watched it all with quiet satisfaction. He'd seen communities heal before, seen people find their courage after years of living under a bully's thumb. It didn't happen overnight, but this was a start. Sarah turned to him, and in her eyes he saw gratitude, exhaustion, and something else, a question perhaps, about what came next. "You should rest," Elias said. "You've been through more in the last 3 days than most people endure in a lifetime." "So have you." Sarah glanced at what remained of his wagon, still scattered in pieces up the mountain. "You gave up everything to save me, your home, your supplies, your comfort. I don't know how to repay that. Don't need repayment. It was the right thing to do. Still," she paused, choosing her words carefully. "You said you keep drifting because towns feel too crowded, too full of other people's lives. And I understand that. I do. But Elias, if you ever wanted to stop drifting, Hope's End could use someone like you. We could use someone who knows how to stand up to bullies, who doesn't compromise on what's right." Elias thought about that, thought about staying in one place, putting down roots, being part of a community again. The idea both attracted and terrified him. Since Margaret and his daughters had died, he'd avoided attachment like it was a disease. Caring about people meant you could lose them. Loving them meant you could watch them die. But maybe that was the wrong way to look at it. Maybe the point wasn't to avoid loss, but to make the time you had matter. "I'll think about it," he said finally. "For now, let's just focus on getting those kids healthy and making sure Hutchins doesn't try anything else stupid." Sarah smiled, and it transformed her tired face. "Deal." They worked through the night, Sarah checking on her young patients, Elias standing guard to ensure no more attempts at arson or revenge. The children continued to improve, their breathing easier, their fevers dropping. By dawn, it was clear that the crisis had passed. All 6 would survive. Doctor Morrison called it a miracle, Elias called it good medicine and better courage. Sarah called it what her grandmother would have called it, knowledge, compassion, and the healing power of care given freely to those in need. 3 weeks later, Elias stood in front of Sarah's house watching the last of the repairs being completed. The townspeople had insisted on fixing the fire damage, and they'd done more than just repair, they'd improved. New floorboards, reinforced walls, a fresh coat of paint. The house looked better than it had before, and the herb garden had been carefully tended by Mrs. Abernathy and several other women who wanted to learn about medicinal plants. The children had all recovered fully. Emma was running around with the other kids again, her laughter carrying across the valley. Daniel Hutchins had made a full recovery too, and his mother had brought him to thank Sarah personally, with no mention of his father. James Hutchins had kept to himself since that night, running his businesses, but no longer trying to run the town. The council had formally elected Mrs. Abernathy as interim mayor, and she was proving to be fair, sensible, and considerably less interested in wielding power than in serving the community. Sarah had become Hope's End's official healer, working alongside Dr. Morrison. The two of them made an effective team. Morrison's medical training combined with Sarah's traditional knowledge created something better than either could have achieved alone. They'd started teaching others too, sharing their knowledge instead of hoarding it. 3 young women were apprenticing with Sarah, learning about herbs and remedies. Morrison had begun holding informal classes on basic medical care for anyone interested. Knowledge, they'd both realized, was less dangerous when it was shared, when people understood it instead of fearing it. Elias had stayed to help with the repairs, telling himself he was just making sure Sarah was settled before moving on. But 3 weeks had stretched into something longer, and he found himself less eager to leave with each passing day. Buster seemed happy enough. The donkey had a warm stall at the livery, regular meals, and the attention of several children who'd taken to feeding him carrots and apples. He'd saved a woman's life with his stubborn refusal to move past that snowbank, and if the donkey was aware of his heroism, he showed it only by accepting the extra treats as his due. Thinking about heading out? Elias turned to find Sarah approaching, a basket over her arm. She'd filled out some in the past weeks, the gauntness from her ordeal replaced by healthy color and energy. Her hair was neatly pinned, and she wore a simple blue dress that matched her eyes. Thinking about it, Elias admitted. Though Buster seems pretty settled, might have to drag him away. Or you could stay. Sarah set down the basket. It was full of fresh bread, cheese and apples, probably meant for one of her patients. The town's hiring a deputy sheriff. Rawlings suggested you. Said he could use someone with military experience, someone who knows how to keep the peace without being anyone's puppet. I'm not a lawman. You're someone who does the right thing, even when it costs you everything. That's the only qualification that matters. She paused, then added more softly. And I could use a friend. Someone who understands what it's like to lose everything and have to build again. Elias looked at her, really looked at her, and saw not just a healer or a woman who'd survived, but a person who'd found the strength to forgive people who'd tried to kill her, who'd chosen compassion over bitterness. That took a kind of courage, he understood, a kind he respected deeply. I'd have to get a new wagon, he said slowly. Can't be a proper drifter without a wagon. Or you could get a house, put down roots, see what it's like to have neighbors who know your name, who care if you show up for Sunday dinner. It was terrifying, the idea of staying. Terrifying and appealing in equal measure. Elias thought about his daughters, about Margaret, about all the years he'd spent running from the pain of losing them. He'd thought that keeping moving would keep him safe, that if he never cared too deeply again, he'd never hurt that badly again. But he'd been hurting anyway, carrying that grief with him every mile, every camp, every lonely night under the stars. Maybe it was time to try something different. Maybe it was time to honor his family's memory, not by running from connection, but by building something meaningful again. I'll think about it, he said, which was more than he would have said a month ago. Sarah smiled, understanding that this was progress. Fair enough. In the meantime, Mrs. Abernathy's hosting a dinner tonight, celebrating the children's full recovery. You're invited. Buster too, if you can get him to behave indoors. I'll be there. She picked up her basket and headed toward the miller's house, where their youngest had a persistent cough that needed checking. Elias watched her go, this woman who'd been left to die in a blizzard and who'd responded to that cruelty not with revenge, but with healing, not with hatred, but with forgiveness. He reached into his pocket and pulled out the small leather case that held the daguerreotype of his family. He looked at Margaret's face, at Anna's and Elizabeth's smiles, and he thought maybe they'd understand. Maybe they'd want him to stop running, to find peace, to build something good in their memory. "What do you think?" he asked their silent images. "Should an old drifter finally find a place to settle?" The answer, of course, came not from the photograph, but from inside himself. From the part of him that was tired of running, tired of being alone, ready to risk caring again, even if it meant risking loss. That night, at Mrs. Abernathy's dinner, Elias sat at a table surrounded by people who were becoming familiar, who knew his name and his story. Sarah sat across from him, and when their eyes met, he saw understanding there, and hope, and the beginning of something that might, given time, grow into more than friendship. Outside, the first snow of the season was starting to fall, soft and gentle, nothing like the blizzard that had brought them together. Through the window, Elias could see Hope's End, settling in for winter smoke rising from chimneys, lights glowing warm in windows, a community that had faced its fears and emerged stronger. He'd come to these mountains as a drifter with no destination and no purpose beyond survival. He'd found a woman dying in the snow and made a choice that cost him everything he owned. And in return, he'd found something worth more than any wagon or supplies or life on the trail. He'd found a reason to stop drifting. He'd found home.